All right, thank you, Rami. That was a great talk. Definitely learned a lot about from all those breaches. So it's good to learn from other people's mistakes, better than your own mistakes. So thank you very much. We'll bring on the next speaker shortly. Actually, it's 10:44, so let's get ready to bring on our next speaker, David. Before that, I would like to say a special thank you to Palo Alto Networks for the gold sponsorship. Be sure to visit their Discord breakout room and enter their raffle for a chance to win some cool prizes. But let's introduce David Branscome. He's going to be speaking on A Hunting We Will Go, Adventures in Endpoint Threat Detection. So thank you, David, and let's get started.
All right. I'm assuming you can hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right. Off. All right. All right, so my name's Dave Branscome. I'm a cloud security architect with Microsoft. And so as you can imagine, a lot of the information that I'm going to be talking about today is going to be slanted toward a Microsoft environment and how endpoint threat detection can be done in a Microsoft environment. So let's talk about the problem that we're trying to address with this. Let me get rid of this little message here. So a lot of the network defense goes wrong before there's any contact with an adversary, and that starts with how defenders think about the battlefield. So most defenders, if you think about it, look at the idea of protecting their assets. And so that means prioritizing them, maybe sorting them by workload, maybe by business function. So they think of lists of things that they need to protect. Attackers, on the other hand, breach a network by landing somewhere in the network graph and use, and that could be done through a number of different techniques, but it could be something as simple as just a phishing email. And so wherever they land in that graph, then they just have to figure out where do they go from there to get to the assets that they need. Once they have that entry point, how do they pivot? How do they move laterally? Because they aren't following the defender's list. They aren't looking at it from the perspective of, okay, first I have to go through the firewall, then I have to evade the detections in the IDS or the IPS or whatever. They're just looking at wherever I get in, how do I get to what I want at that point? And so as long as there's this divergence in thinking, this difference in the way that defenders and attackers think, attackers are going to win because we're approaching the battlefield from the wrong perspective as defenders. So as defenders for years, we build our defenses in this way, based on the assumption that attackers will launch attacks in the order that we have prioritized our defenses. In reality, that isn't how it works at all. Attackers don't care where their entry to the network is. They only care that they're able to get in. And so they can move wherever they need to go once they're inside the network. So what we're going to do is kind of walk through an example of an attack that is a fairly common way that an attacker would breach a network and how they would move laterally across the network. And we'll see how some of the tools that we've built into Microsoft Defender and some of the other tools, Office 365 ATP, Azure ATP, how these are able to detect an attack and how you can use that to comprehensively understand the way that an attacker breached the network from just a malicious email all the way to the point where they're exfiltrating the NTDS DIT, right? All right, so let's go hunting. So what I'm going to do here is start off, we've got four different views up here, 4 different portals that we're going to look at first. So the first is the Office 365 Security and Compliance Center. And in this case, what we're looking at is we've got an email message that is detected to contain some malware. So this was malware that was detected and removed after delivery. So this is not uncommon. Sometimes messages will get through that contain a piece of malware that is not caught by the initial message hygiene servers. These kind of things happen on a fairly regular basis. If we look at the Defender Security Center, so here we're looking at the actual endpoints, we see that there has been a possible credential theft from the NTDS DIT. So the NTDS DIT file, as most of you are probably very well aware, is the or the Windows NT Directory Services file. This is the heart of Active Directory. It's where all of Active Directory is stored, including password hashes. So if an attacker gets a hold of the NTDS DIT, then they're able to extract information about the users in the domain and even steal the credentials for those users. And that allows them to elevate their privileges and reach the assets that they're interested in. If I go to Cloud App Security, which is our cloud access security broker, we see that there was a suspected overpass the hash attack taking place, right? So an overpass the hash attack is a lateral movement technique where an attacker steals an NTLM hash and creates a forged Kerberos ticket from it to gain permissions of a more privileged user. So in this case, we can see that the attacker was able to leverage the credentials and authenticate successfully to a Nets PC. And then finally, we're in the Microsoft 365 Security Center. And so here we can see all the different alerts that are coming into the Security Center. So if you're on the SecOps team, you can see that there are the same 3 alerts that we just looked at in these other portals. So we can see things like suspected credential theft activity. We see suspicious behavior by Microsoft Word, an email message containing malware. So we see many of the same alerts that we saw in these other portals synthesized into a single portal, right? So the key thing that we're looking at here is that alerts are surfaced in individual portals, but they're also combined into a single view that a SOC analyst would be able to pull these different alerts from different locations together and be able to start to make sense of them. We scroll down a little bit. Here we have the possible credential theft from the NTDS DIT, right? So all the same alerts that we saw over here are brought together into the M365 Security Center. We scroll over. And so the important thing to note here is that we have the sources of these alerts highlighted as well. And so wherever these alerts are coming from, where they're originating, if they come from Cloud App Security, if they come from Defender, if they come from Windows Active Directory or Azure Active Directory rather, they'll be identified here so that you can see what source generated the alerts. All right, so let's go here, close this, close that, and we'll just work in this alerts view. All right, so we're in the alert for this particular incident, okay? So if we go to the summary of the incident, here we get a summary overview of the entire incident all up. So if you're on the SecOps team, you can start to make some informed triage decisions here. And it also helps us to track the progress on remediating the threat and restoring whatever assets have been impacted, restoring them to a healthy and secure state. So the first thing that we see here is that we are tracking which tactics were used from a MITRE perspective. This is really important because throughout the use of this tool, you see indications and messages that show which MITRE attack tactics have been used in this particular incident. So we see the alert chain here. If we scroll down a little bit, also we see the impacted devices, the impacted users. You see that there was an impacted mailbox. So as part of this overall incident, these are the impacted entities that we care about. These are the ones that we have to investigate. Scroll down a little bit. We also have the ability to group things according to tags. So we can tag resources in our environment and say, these are things that have sensitive data. These are things that are part of the same incident, right? So we can tag resources and say they're part of incident number 65043 or whatever, and then remove those tags after the fact so that we can kind of group them according to that tagging capability. But what I want you to notice over here is the timeline. So the timeline shows us how things were carried out in progression. So we're taking a look at the individual alerts and correlating them together according to how the attacker moved maybe from a malicious email file, a file in an email, and then how they moved to running a suspicious PowerShell command. They started enumerating SMB sessions and so on. So you get a sense for how the attacker has performed the attack. Let's open the alerts here. So we're back here in the alerts tab, right? We were in the summary tab. Now we're back in the alerts tab. So we see that there was malware identified, and this was delivered through Exchange into the user's Outlook mailbox. And this was based on a file hash or a comparison of the file hashes that was done by Microsoft Defender for Office 365. So we see here that this malicious file was detected based on an indication provided by Office 365. And so let's open that up. If we dig into this individual alert, we have a lot of information about the alert itself. As the alerts are triggered, there are security playbooks behind the scenes in Office 365 that actually go into effect. So these security playbooks are, you might think of them as back-end policies that are at the heart of the automation in Microsoft Defender and in overall the Microsoft 365 Security Center. So a security playbook is launched automatically when specific types of alerts are triggered within an organization. Once that alert is triggered, the playbook is run by what is called the Automated Investigation and Response System, AIR system. The investigation steps look at all the associated metadata of the alert, including things like the message that was delivered, the user that received the message, any devices that the user was on at the time. And then based on the investigation playbook's findings, the automated investigation recommends a set of actions that your organization's security team can take to control and mitigate that threat. So let's go over here to the investigations tab. Now here we can see the investigations that are associated with this overall incident. So there are individual investigations taking place triggered by the alerts, right? So this allows our SecOps team to quickly review the investigations, what alerts triggered them, what their status is, where the alert came from, as you can see here, the service source, as well as the entities that were involved, right? Which machines were involved in this particular incident. So if we go again to the malicious file was detected based on the indication provided by Office 365, we get an investigation graph, right? So this investigation graph gives us a sense of the things that were investigated as part of this specific investigation. We looked at Barbara's PC, we looked at files, services, and so on. On that machine, we found that there was one file that was remediated. If we go to devices, we get some information coming from the Defender for Endpoint Center. And so if we click on Barbara's machine, we get some information over here. We can tell what domain her machine is a member of, what OS she's running. Within Defender, we have the ability to fully automate remediation. So there's different levels of automated remediation that can take place. So if you have, for example, a medical device that is running Windows on the background, you might say, I don't want that to be automatically remediated because then it's going to fall outside of the standards that we have that these medical devices shouldn't be tampered with unless there's a strict change control log. So you can define how these assets should be remediated. In this case, this one's fully automated with the remediation. And if we scroll down here, this is a key point here. We see that users that have logged on to this particular machine, Barbara's PC, the ones that have logged on are Barbara and Eric Gubbles. Now, this is going to become important because as the attacker logs onto the machine, he wants to try to elevate his privileges. And so Eric Gubbles is going to be one of the entities that's going to be exploited in this particular incident. Let's go back up here to the overall incident and click on the alerts tab again. And we'll go to this email messages. All right, so we looked at this once already. Actually, let's go to investigation. All right, one of the investigations shows here, mail with malware is zapped. Okay, so zapped, zap just stands for 0-hour auto purge, 0-hour auto purge, zap. So what this is doing is if a message comes into your email system and contains a piece of malware, but it's not detected by the system initially, but then later on, we do identify it as malware, we can go back in and perform this 0-hour auto purge that will go through all the mailboxes in your environment and remove instances of that malware in those mailboxes. This will also be done against all Office 365 tenants. So if this piece of malware is identified in your particular tenant, we'll zap it from your tenant, but we'll also then use the information that we receive to zap it from any other tenants that exist around the world. Okay, so notice here that we've got some IDs and statuses and things like this. What we're going to do is click on this ID number, and we'll go to alerts and click on the Zapped Malware alert. All right, now in the details section here, I want you to notice where we've identified this email as having come into. We see that it came into Barbara's mailbox. So she's the one that initially received the email. That's our starting point. Now let's go to the email. So we start to look at the alerts that are contained related to email. And so we see things related to different attachments. So we're looking at the file hash in the attachments for the email. We're looking at clusters of email that are sent from Juno.com. So that's where the attacker sent the email from. We're looking at subject lines. We're looking at source IP addresses, and then another subject line. There must be something slightly different about that one. But we're trying to narrow down where else this type of email might have been sourced. Now let's look at the email received by Barbara. So the alert got into this incident because it triggered the same user mailbox of Barbara at mtpdemos.net. Okay, we see that the sender was this user at juno.com. And so, like I said, we've got these different clusters of email that help us to narrow down where this email was sourced from and can help us to track any other attacks that were very similar, maybe coming from the same Juno address or coming from the same IP address or that contain the same file hash. And so we can see instances of how the message was handled, whether it was detected as phishing, whether it was sent to a junk mailbox, whether it was blocked, whatever it might have been. Okay, so we now know that based on this incident, the malware didn't stop simply at Barbara's mailbox. And we go back to the alerts. Scroll down a little bit. We can also see from the alerts that the attacker began to enumerate information about users that had recently had a session open to a domain controller, right? So we see enumeration of SMB sessions on a domain controller. We see user and IP address reconnaissance done over SMB. So let's look at that. And if I start to look into the details of this individual alert, if we look at the alert details, we see the service source is Azure ATP. We see when this happened, and then in the alert description, we see that the user account, Barbara, opened up some SMB sessions to the domain controller and received some IP addresses for 2 accounts. So let's get some more detail about this. Now we switched over to Cloud App Security. Okay, so we're moving into a different portal. Now notice here the attackers inside the network. They got initial access to Barbara's PC, and from there they began to enumerate these SMB sessions to the domain controller. They received information about some IP addresses and 2 accounts. So let's see what the information was that they received. They got information about Barbara or about some IP addresses that were exposed. Same thing for this other machine. So Barbara seems to be one of the people that's being targeted here. So we want to find out more about Barbara and what risk this poses to the organization. So let's close this and let's go to the Users tab. So remember, before we highlighted the entities that were identified as being at risk in this incident. So Rotambu is one of the people that was identified. Eric Gubbles is another one, and Barbara is one. So let's take a look at Barbara. And if I open the user page for Barbara, it takes me again to Cloud App Security. It gives me some information about Barbara. So who she is, where she was last logged on, how many times she was logged on, what devices she interacts with, how to contact her, and things like that. We scroll down, we see her contact information, and we can get in contact with her and find out information. So for example, one of the things that shows up here is we're seeing activity from an infrequent country. So we could make contact with Barbara and ask her, did you log in from this other country recently? Were you on vacation? Were you, traveling for work? Whatever it might be, to get some more context for the things that we see happening here. Digging a little bit deeper, we check the investigation priority of Barbara, and we're asking the question of where does she stand in terms of security or risk for the organization. So we see that over the last 2 weeks, she's in the top 90% risk category for the entire organization. So there's clearly something happening with Barbara's account that we need to investigate. And this investigation priority is built on the alerts that are associated with her and the risky activities that are associated with her. So we see a whole lot of activities and alerts taking place here. Some things like suspicious inbox forwarding, a mass deletion of files, remote code execution attempts. All these things give us indicators that something unusual is happening with Barbara's account. So the advanced hunting tool is what we can use now to start to hunt over the different security telemetry settings that are coming from all these different sources. So if we go here to go hunt, this is going to take us to a different portal. And this is where we can do one of two different things, right? So we can either initiate an investigation that starts with a hypothesis, that we think something is happening in the organization, or we can start from an ongoing investigation. This tool is using what we call Custo Query Language, KQL. This is a tool that is also used in, or a language that's also used in log analytics, Azure Sentinel, or cloud-based SIEM, as well as in Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. So with this, we can perform queries against our environment, and it can very quickly query thousands of endpoints and bring back information that's important to us. So notice that we're going to be looking for the account name Barbara. We're going to be looking, for different account SIDs and so on. So we don't need all this detail to run the query, so we're going to remove some of it. Highlight a little bit of it. And now we're just looking for some basic information here. So let's run the query. And notice we get back some information here from the query from Active Directory. And we start to see some interesting information about the actions that were taken. So you remember that there were queries done and enumeration of groups. So when this when there was a query done, perhaps the attacker was trying to figure out who are the local admins that have access to these servers, who are the people that are part of domain admins. So we start to see that type of query taking place here, and so we understand what the attacker was doing with the privileges that they had received. So they found out that they were able to log in as Barbara, but they were also able to find out who else was a member of this, the local admins on this machine. This person maybe had higher privileges, and so they use those privileges to begin enumerating the groups on the machine. And then from there, they're able to start doing queries about some higher privileged groups. All right, lateral movement. So we head back here to the incident and to the alerts tab, and we want to see how the attacker is going to try to gain the credentials of more privileged users and start to move laterally. So currently they have privileges for Barbara, but what else do they want to do? So we see down here that there was this reconnaissance that took place, the user and IP address reconnaissance. And so if we scroll down a little bit, you see here that there's some credential theft actions taking place, suspected credential theft activity, malicious credential theft. We see the use of Mimikatz, right? We see the suspicious LSAS process access. So clearly the attacker is trying to perform some sort of attack against the user credentials and escalate their privileges. Going back to the users, let's go take a look at Eric now. Now, what this tells us, just at a quick glance, is that Eric is a member of the help desk team. He's a member of information technology. What that means, or what we can infer from this, is that since he is a member of the help desk team, then the likelihood is that he has local admin permissions on Barbara's PC. We know that Barbara's PC was the one that was compromised, and Eric likely has local admin permissions to that PC. It also may explain some other um, credential escalations for a user named Roberto. So if we go to the next page of the alerts, we see a suspected overpass the hash attack, and we see that this took place on Roberto's machine. Okay, so let's take a look a little bit closer at this. If we scroll down, all right, let's take a look at the alert description here. So here we see Roberto Tamburello is the infrastructure services manager on this PC, and he was successfully authenticated against this domain controller. Okay, so again, a privileged user, and we're performing an authentication against the DC. So this is starting to look more concerning. Scrolling down, we see the impacted assets. We see his PC is impacted. We click on the top impacted entities. There again, we see his machine and we see his user account. Okay, so we see that it wasn't just the machine that was compromised, but also potentially his user account has been compromised. Go back. Let's scroll down a little bit. So going back to some of the alerts that we were looking at, remember we talked about this suspicious LSAS process, and then we've also got this successful logon using potentially stolen credentials. So this tells us that there was some suspicious activity performed, and as a result of that activity, this credential theft, the attacker was able to log on using stolen credentials. Let's scroll over. So we're 1, 2, 3 lines up. 1, 2, 3. And so we see that the detection source in this case was Defender ATP. We see that it was a lateral movement activity. They were able to connect to an AAD Connect server, and this was the detection source was Microsoft Threat Protection. So this gives us the ability to automatically detect any new anomalies by correlating these alerts and the events that are coming from these Microsoft sources. All right, let's open up this suspicious LSAS process. So why was this alert triggered? So we saw the overpass the hash attack, right? And then it was enriched by more data and activities that were observed on the same device. So we see that there was this overpass the hash attack. They obtained a password hash from memory and then used the hash to obtain a ticket. Scroll down a little bit. And with the domain admin credentials, the attacker was able to move laterally within the domain, right? So this kind of tells us that because of this compromise of Roberto's machine and Roberto's user account, they were able to escalate their privileges to domain admin. Now, what did they do with this? Here we see that they performed this credential theft from the NTDS DIT. And so what we see taking place here is that they dumped the NTDS DIT in order to obtain the credentials that they need, which are stored on the domain controller. So we've got our alert details here. We've got the alert that was triggered by the actions that were taking place. And we see the impacted assets. So the impacted asset in this case is the domain controller. All right. Let's take a look at one more thing. So they've compromised the NTDS DIT. They've been able to capture it and start stealing credentials from it. And then what else did they do? Well, we see that there was suspicious inbox forwarding. So let's take a look at what they did there. It's not uncommon for attackers to set up inbox forwarding rules once they've compromised a set of users in order to exfiltrate data. And so likely the attacker is using this to exfiltrate some sensitive data. So at the top, the top right of this alert, we see that it's part of the same incident that we've been investigating all along. So it's all part of the same incident. Tells us what the severity is of this this overall incident. And notice from this this individual alert, we see the description of what took place. We see that the user is an administrator. We see that this is the IP address that the forwarding was configured from, and then we see the MITRE tactic that is being leveraged in this case to perform the attack. So the attacker is now exfiltrating data from the organization after having escalated their privileges and again compromising the NTDS DIT. Let's now go to the Action Center. So in the Action Center, we see a list of pending actions that a security administrator can act on and respond to different security alerts. So this is, again, an aggregated view of a whole bunch of different sources across Microsoft 365 and Azure to enable proactive solutions to different threats that exist. Let's go to the History tab. Now, if I want to filter the events, I can go and filter last 6 months. I want to get a few more items on each page. And if I click on filters, scroll up, what I want to look for are quarantined files. So this quarantine file action shows us the details of the file, which ones were automatically remediated, and there's also a detailed report that shows what kind of malware the file contains. So let's take a look. And we want to look at the domain controller asset and apply. So if we go a little bit into our history list, there was user activity where a process was stopped. And so we want to take a look at that incident. So we're going to take a look at the first result here. At the top of this alert, you can open the automatic investigation page that gives us more information about this particular alert. We're able to either approve or reject these suggested actions that are provided here. And then down here, we get information about the file itself. So we see there was a file, a PowerShell script that was run called invoke token manipulation.ps1. A little more information here. We go to the alert details. We got some more information, and notice again, we have timing for the event. We have information about the detection source. We have information about the incident, and then what the recommended actions are to remediate this incident. In this case, there was an automated investigation that was performed, and the issue was remediated. But if it was unable to be remediated automatically, we could take action manually to resolve the issue. Let's clear the filters. And now what we're going to do is filter by the stop process filter. There we go. Apply. So here we have some processes that were stopped. And we have information about the process name, the process ID. In this case, it was always named notepad.exe. It's not uncommon for attackers to rename processes to something that looks innocuous. Let's take a look at this one. And now if we look in the action details, we see that somehow this Notepad application tried to run some PowerShell scripts, which or PowerShell code rather, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. That shouldn't be what's happening here. So we see a process abnormally injected code into another process. Unexpected code may be running in the target process memory. Injection is often used to hide malicious code execution within a trusted process. So here we see the MITRE attack technique, process injection. And we clearly know what's taking place. The attacker is using Notepad as a method of injecting this PowerShell process and running this PowerShell process. So let's take a look over here in the hunting menu, and we're going to go find out how we can prevent the attacker from getting into the network the same way again. Okay, so let's go to the Get Started tab. And over here, let's scroll down a little bit. Now we can have saved queries. So the query that we ran before in to identify the machines that had Barbara Moreland's PC or that had Barbara Moreland's email address associated with it, we can save queries if we want to. So let's take a look at what's already been saved here. We see one for MTP demo outside email with URL to log on and file download. So we've already got a query saved here that takes the action that when an email is sent from outside the organization, after the email has been received and it tries to steal the credentials of an end user, we want to identify that type of action with this query. So let's run the query, and we see the results that came back here. So we see one here with the email subject of important MCG season blah blah blah. Okay, so we get some information here that Ann Hill and her mailbox received the same email. And so what we want to do is take a section of this query, insert the indicator of compromise that identifies this actor, and create a custom detection to let the SecOps team know that when that actor comes back in the network, we're able to identify them. So that IOC that they're going to use is the domain that the actor sent the emails containing malware from, which was juno.com. So basically, this allows the query to run in the background and create an alert when the same activity happens again. So let's create a detection rule. And we'll call this rule add email to endpoint. We'll select the frequency of every 3 hours. So this alert is running every 3 hours. We'll call the alert title add email to endpoint as well. We'll click on the severity and we'll call it medium. Select the category, and here we can define what type of category it is. We can define the MITRE technique that we consider this to be. So we're considering it a spear phishing with attachment. And then we'll just put a brief description in here. And then click next. Check for looking in the mailboxes. Recipient email address.
All right, David. Sorry, we gotta cut you off here. It's 11:30, and it's time for our next speaker.
Okay.